Cockpits and virtual reality are practically made for one another. That sensation of placing yourself within a virtualized vehicle delivers a sense of place and realism beyond anything you can experience on a flat screen. Yet earlier VR headsets, including the original PSVR, were limited both by lower fidelity panels and the hardware driving them. There were VR racing games on PlayStation 4, of course, such as Drive Club VR, but it was clear that a lot of things had to be sacrificed to deliver this experience. Which is precisely why the arrival of Gran Turismo 7 on PSVR2 is so exciting. Unlike GT Sport in VR, the entirety of Gran Turismo 7 is now playable within virtual reality. This no-compromise approach has the potential to provide a truly killer experience, but does it deliver? Well, if you've already taken the plunge on a PSVR2 headset, you know that it works well. But it can be difficult to determine just which sacrifices were necessary to make the jump. Thus, for today's video, I'll be guiding you through the experience while showcasing side-by-side footage demonstrating how the PSVR2 version stacks up against that original experience. So grab your racing wheel and let's get to it. Gran Turismo 7's VR mode comes courtesy of an update. Whether you've played it before or are new to the experience, you'll need to update Gran Turismo 7 to the latest patch to access PSVR2 support. This also brings with it a host of other new features, including the fancy new Sophie artificial intelligence, which I'll touch on later. Once you begin though, it's not immediately clear how you actually play in VR. The game's menu system is presented as a floating image within the VR space, much like any other non-VR game. Turns out, VR activates automatically when entering a race or selecting a specific VR mode. This is rather different than most VR games which simply boot up in VR mode. But this approach does highlight some interesting aspects, however. For starters, when you first slip on the headset, the system will ask you to hold your controller. Unlike most PSVR games, however, GT7 does not require the Sense controllers. You can simply pick up a DualSense pad instead and you're good to go. Of course, if you wanted to use the Sense controllers, you're out of luck as they do not work with Gran Turismo 7. On the more useful side, however, GT7 offers seamless switching between VR and normal gameplay. Simply remove your headset at any time and the game will switch back to 2D mode. Put the headset back on and you'll return to VR. It's impressively seamless. Once you really sit down and begin racing, however, the benefits are immediately clear. The cockpit VR experience is sublime. Look, Gran Turismo 7 features some of the most detailed cockpits in racing game history, but in its original form when played on a TV, I never actually used them, simply because they occupied too much space on screen, making it difficult to see the road before you. In virtual reality, all that changes and the cockpit suddenly becomes this natural place, beautifully replicating the sense of scale you'd expect from driving a real car. Everything is scaled perfectly, from the wheel itself to the various dials and readouts. It's all meticulously crafted and realized. All that work poured into those realistic PBR materials finally pays off. It's striking. Thanks to this newfound realism, however, it becomes even easier to view and appreciate the tracks themselves, and this perhaps showcases the benefits of VR more than most games. From the steep bend in Laguna Seca to the sheer curves of Daytona, suddenly these tracks feel gigantic and imposing. Hills now feel like proper hills, and it becomes a lot easier to fully appreciate the track design in a way that I just never experienced when playing on a regular TV. Suddenly, racing feels more intense. Proper depth perception made possible via stereoscopic 3D allows you to more accurately judge curves and the position of your rivals. Sense of speed is boosted, while turns now feel exceptionally thrilling. Couple this with a racing wheel, and it quickly becomes one of the most immersive VR experiences you can have today. In fact, at several points, my brain instinctively reached for the virtual wheel within the game world, which is sized larger than the Logitech wheel I'm using, only to be met with air instead. It's wild stuff. Of course, in its original form, GT7 is a native 4K game targeting 60 frames per second, but the added demands of VR make that target all but impossible. We are still dealing with a game console after all, and there are limitations. GT7 now renders out two distinct views, one for each eye. And thanks to these comparison shots, we can finally gain a better understanding of how this was achieved. In fact, at first glance, the results are surprising. The overall level of detail feels weirdly consistent between VR and normal mode, which is unlike anything we saw with PSVR1 games. If you lean in and look a little more closely, however, you'll begin to spot the areas where sacrifices were necessary. So overall track detail is reduced slightly. Things like grass density take a hit, for instance, and there can be more visible pop-in. The lighting and bloom have also seemingly been tweaked, though this one is difficult to gauge given that the social screen used here is tone mapped from the HDR shown within the headset itself. Certain weather effects have also been altered. The particle rain system, for instance, sees a reduction in quality when used on PSVR2, as you can see here. Oh, and motion blur has been disabled entirely, perhaps predictably. Per pixel motion blur looks amazing in normal gameplay, but it doesn't really make sense in virtual reality. But the most significant change stems from the rendering resolution targets. Pixel counts are now reduced, resulting in more obvious aliasing and pixelation if you look closely. Within the headset, it's still very sharp, mind you, but you can certainly tell that clarity has taken a hit. During the actual race, however, most of these changes are surprisingly difficult to spot. It usually requires a head-to-head comparison to really appreciate those tweaks made to bring this game to PSVR2, and it's hugely superior to what was on offer in GT Sport when used with PSVR1. The benefits of stereoscopic 3D and head tracking more than make up for any loss in fidelity, and I think most people will be happy with this. Of course, some of the limitations that were present in the original 2D version are even more obvious in VR. The reduced rate reflections, for instance, are extremely obvious when racing in VR. Though it is pretty cool that you can see your own helmet reflected in the steering wheel of the BMW Z8. Of course, on the more positive side, there are other aspects of the rendering that stand out a lot more in a positive way when played via PSVR2. High intensity lights, for instance. Thanks to HDR, when a car pulls up behind you and you catch the glimpse of their headlamps in your rearview mirror, it's almost blinding. Same goes when passing beneath street lamps in an open cockpit vehicle. I really cannot overstate the benefits of HDR in this game. It's the closest any VR game has come to simulate the true intensity of a light source. Now, I should also mention that GT7 uses foveated rendering, like most other games for the system. The implementation here, though, is rather interesting. Essentially, areas outside of your focal point are rendered at a dramatically lower resolution. It's closer to something like 240p than 4K. In other games such as Horizon, the out-of-focus area is definitely lower res, but it's not that visible when looking at the social screen. With GT7, however, the pixelation is extremely noticeable. That is, unless you're actually racing, and this is the key. When using the headset itself, you won't see any of these problems, at least when using the eye tracking. Because yes, eye-tracked foveated rendering is also used in GT7. In this test, I'm moving my eyes back and forth. Note how the pixelation changes according to eye position. If you disable this feature, however, the foveated rendering is simply fixed to the far edge of the screen. What's unique about this implementation is that the eye tracking only seems to influence the outer edges of the view, never the inside. So it's a little different from other games that have shipped. Overall though, I think Polyphony Digital has done a fantastic job of balancing the game's visuals for VR, and it serves as a demonstration of what a more powerful machine can bring to the table. With PSVR1, it was extremely obvious from the beginning that the sacrifices necessary to deliver stereoscopic 3D versions of games at a decent frame rate was just too much for the PS4 hardware to handle. The sheer volume of cutbacks and quality reductions was too great in my eyes. With GT7, however, what you're left with in VR still looks and runs better than GT7 on a PS4 Pro in the normal 2D mode, which I think says a lot. It's a very convincing and robust presentation. So what about the performance then? Well, as with our other coverage, there's no real way to accurately measure the game's performance using the system's social screen output. From what I can tell within the headset, however, the game seems to run at 60 frames per second, just like the normal version. There has not been an increase to 90 or 120 frames per second here. As a result, if you look closely, you may notice this double image effect when moving around, suggesting that the headset is operating in 120Hz mode while the game is rendering at 60. It's the same exact problem you'll get when using 60Hz content within a 120Hz container on a low persistence display such as an OLED screen with black frame insertion. The high brightness of the game also seems to have an impact on overall clarity and motion. The low persistence nature of the display does vary based on how bright the image is. As a result, there's more visible persistence blur in GT7 than most other PSVR2 games I've tested. It's still perfectly playable, mind you, but I would have loved seeing a native 90Hz option with further reduced visuals. But beyond the racing itself, what else can you do in VR? Well, firstly, there's the VR replay system. When using this option, the game basically places you within the track environment itself, allowing you to observe the race from your standing position. If you have the space around you, you can even walk about freely within this area. As each car passes, however, the camera will automatically transport you to the next point, which can feel a little jarring. There's also the showcase mode, which allows you to walk around the various cars while closely examining each model from close proximity. This mode really highlights the amazing attention to detail and the quality of the materials work on display. This option is available for all the various cars throughout the game too, and it's a great way to appreciate the craftsmanship that has been poured into them. But of course, the other big feature added to this version of GT7 is the AI Sophie. Available in a select few races for a limited time, unfortunately, Sophie promises to inject increased realism into the AI driving model. In most racing games, including Gran Turismo, there's always a sense that the computer opponents are just affixed to a predefined driving line, which honestly is something the player might aspire to as well, but in reality, mistakes will be made and your line is likely to feel less perfect, or at least more personal. And that's what Sophie brings to the track. It makes mistakes, it reacts differently to your driving style, and it behaves more like a human driver. But not the social media breed of human, rather someone that's actually taking the race seriously, but not always quite nailing it. There's evidence of real trepidation and caution, which I found utterly fascinating. Plus the vehicles seem to have genuine personality, something amplified if you enable the driver names above cars where a small emoji is used to indicate its current feelings. AI in racing games is always a tricky subject. If the AI is simply too perfect and computer-like, it's not a lot of fun for most players. Make it too easy though, and it's just boring. But relying on rubber banding to make up for it doesn't really help either. So in that sense, this new AI model is extremely fascinating. Coupling Sophie with PSVR2 though results in one of the most immersive racing experiences you could imagine on a game console, and I'm eager to see where this AI goes next. After all, the idea that players are basically feeding data to Sophie, allowing it to adapt to driving conditions based on these results, is pretty wild. I tried ramming it a few times too, just to see how it would respond. Hopefully it doesn't learn and use that technique against us. Either way, even if you're not racing in VR, you need to give this a shot, as it's fascinating to see in action. And honestly, I can say the same thing about GT7 in general. Since its release, a lot of things have been tweaked and improved. This is now an even better game than it was at launch, and worth playing if you enjoy racing games. If you have a PSVR2 and a steering wheel though, it goes from worth playing to an absolute must play. It's that good. This implementation is light years beyond GT Sports VR integration, which felt rather half-baked. GT7 is the real deal and one of the best experiences you can get on the VR platform right now. But that's going to do it for this video. Hopefully you enjoyed it, and if so, be sure to let us know, and we'll see you next time.